My name is Matt Sparaza.
Father Sam Kachuba. Is this our first episode of the new year, or is our last episode of the old year?
This is our first episode of the new year.
Woo.
This is our first episode of the new year.
Okay.
Matthew, you're the trendsetter.
Awesome. I'll try to live up to it.
No pressure.
All of 2025 depends on you.
Well,
most people would try and make you feel less pressure in this situation. I want you to feel all the pressure.
That's all right. I thrive under pressure. It'll be fine.
Good. All right.
I think it's very fitting, though. All right, we're starting the new year when we want to make our resolutions. We want to do things differently and everything. And we're starting the new year, and we're going to be coming up, when this is released, on the Feast of the Epiphany, when the three kings came to visit Jesus. We also call them the wise men. And so for our first guest to be Matthew Wiseman, I think it's very fitting.
I love it. That's awesome. Perfect timing.
See, we don't often have people whose names fit in so well to the liturgical time, to history. It's great. Thank you.
It does.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, Matthew, if you do no, please, you go.
No, much hay has been made of the wise men still seek him in with this story, so it's great.
Nice.
Well,
nice. I was gonna say, Matthew, if you do a good enough job, there's a chance that you could actually become the Matthew on this podcast. You could just flat out replace me, and I'll just be relegated to editor, or something like that.
Yeah. That's
Matthew,
Matt behind the glass over there, on the bench.
yeah.
Right.
He's in the booth, but he's not actually talking.
Your story, Matthew, is pretty incredible, and I think it would be advantageous for our listeners for you to just give us an overview, right? Just because you broke your book into the different denominations, for lack of a better way of saying it,
Right.
And I think it'll just be helpful if we get a brief overview of each of these sections before we jump into some nitty-gritty topics,
Sure. So I was born into a pretty typical Texas Southern Baptist family. And that's where I was baptized, and that's where I was raised until I was about 11. And around that time is when things start to get interesting. So that's around 2001, 2002. Okay. And so my parents really liked the idea of keeping the family together for church and for Sunday school, and rather than sort of splitting into age groups. And Sunday school had been age segregated for years and years, but even church was moving that direction with more and more children's church and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really trying to push back on that, and they couldn't find a Baptist church out in Midland where we lived that was interested in working with them on that. So after looking around for a year or two, we ended up doing church at home, just so that the family would be together. And we had some other friends who were doing the same kind of thing, who were doing church at home. And we started talking to them about, why they were doing it. And they were into something called the Hebrew Roots movement. And they lent us some DVDs, and what we learned about from those DVDs was about the biblical feasts, the Old Testament calendar of the feast, the Old Testament liturgical calendar. And the basic premise of these videos was that Jesus had come to fulfill the spring feast, the spring cycle, on his first coming. So Passover and unleavened bread and first fruits, and then Pentecost. And then that he was going to fulfill the fall feasts, which are the New Year, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles on his return. And this was translated into an argument that therefore we should keep these feasts rather than sort of the Christian liturgical year.
Okay.
The spring feast as a memorial, and then the fall feast as an anticipation. And that pretty quickly led to this sort of realization that these were part of a whole code of law and part of a whole lifestyle. And so we started keeping kosher. We started wearing the tassels on our clothes that Moses commands and things like that, and keeping a seventh-day Sabbath. So we got really deep into this Hebrew roots movement. But what became clear very quickly from trying to do that with other people is that there wasn't enough information in Moses to apply his laws. There were gaps, there was information left out, because it was part of a living juridical tradition. There was an oral tradition that accompanied and interpreted it. And you see evidence of that in the way that the laws are applied in Ezra and Nehemiah in particular, where Ezra and Nehemiah make assumptions about the way that the law of Moses is supposed to be observed that are not written in the law of Moses. So it's very clear that there's this broader juridical tradition that interprets it. But no two people, could really agree on details of things like what constituted kosher food and unkosher food. There were some things that we all agreed on. Obviously, you couldn't eat any pork or anything to do with pork, but there were very, very vague areas around the edges. And so if you're trying to live together and you're trying to have any kind of community, it became very challenging very quickly. And so we started to study and observe the Jewish oral traditions, what's called the oral Torah, or the law upon the tongue, the Torah Sheba'al Peh. Even Jesus didn't seem to be opposed to Jewish oral tradition entirely. He talks about tithing mint, dill, and cumin, for instance, which Moses never mentions, but is mentioned in this oral tradition. But there's also a tension. He doesn't seem to agree with everything in the tradition. Seems to agree with it in principle, but then disagree with it in detail. But one of our problems was that we needed an authority who could come in from outside and tell you what the proper interpretation was. Otherwise, how do you come to any agreement? How do you come to have any kind of community? And so there was always this remaining tension of how do we reconcile these things? How do we reconcile the fact that Jesus doesn't seem to think that you need to wash your hands before eating, but that's one of the clearest traditions in the Jewish oral tradition. What do you do with the fact that Jesus says that divorce is not just disallowed, it's ontologically impossible? Whereas Jewish oral tradition, even in its most strict interpretations, allows it in some situations. But the biggest tension was about what did it mean that we were apparently Gentiles, as far as we knew. I don't know of any Jewish ancestry. But with a name like Wiseman, it's possible, and the Wisemans are a little bit obscure, but nothing concrete. But yet we're observing this law that's very clearly aimed at the sort of historical and ethnic Israel, that it has all of these ethnic components about intermarriage and things like that didn't have obvious application to us, and yet we thought that we needed to be observing the law of Moses. Well, what does that mean when it comes to rules about things like endogamy, about marrying inside of the people? How did we square that with St. Paul's understanding in Ephesians, which seems to be Gentiles stay Gentiles, be part of this commonwealth, but you're still Gentile. And so that followed me all the way into college, and I was really wrestling with, we need an authoritative tradition, but the authoritative tradition seemed to be in tension with Jesus. Our identity seemed to be somehow Jewish or Israelite, but also the New Testament didn't seem to totally back us on this idea of like converting and becoming part of ethnic Israel. And so that followed me into college when I started to study Christian history. Not because I wanted to, it was a required course at Baylor, where I did my undergrad. We had a Christian heritage class that was just a general requirement. and I really didn't want to go. I was very resistant. But I was actually really helped by the fact that the professor I had was he was an adjunct. He was a graduate student, and he was an Anabaptist. He was sort of further removed from traditional Christianity than even the Southern Baptists or the Texas Baptists at Baylor. And I had all of this baggage about, well, Constantine changed everything, and he changed the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday, and he added Easter, which was a pagan holiday, and all of this. And this Anabaptist graduate student who was very honest, he didn't like these traditions any more than I did, but he went, no, it has nothing to do with Constantine. Very clearly, these things are being done earlier than that. It's an organic development. And his take was, we don't have to like it. You don't have to keep it, but you can't pretend that this is all pagan accretions. It happened internally. And that messed with my worldview a lot.
As it might.
Yeah, as it might. And it also grew in me a distrust of...
Can I stop you there for a second?
Sure.
That idea of messing with the worldview. Because at first I like the phrase, and I don't want to mess with your worldview or anything, but there's something that you said earlier as you were beginning your story, just that in that search for the chance for the family to both worship and study together, to both worship, to pray, and to learn the faith together. And in that difficulty finding a Baptist church that was going to suit that need, you started doing church at home. Now, the Catholic worldview does not have any such thing as a church at home, except for during COVID when we had to watch Mass on live stream or something like that. So what does church at home look like for a Baptist that's in that searching process?
So I've seen a lot of different things. And that is the Baptist tradition is
a lot of different things.
Yes. For us, it really looked like us and maybe some friends, depending on the week, just sitting around. My dad would get out his guitar and we'd sing a few praise and worship songs, as we would call them, and then he'd read a text of scripture, and then at first my dad would really give sort of a sermon on it. He'd spend some time through the week studying up, and he'd give a little sermon. As we moved into Hebrew roots, that started to look very different. It would still usually start with some singing. The Hebrew roots music is really funny. It's evangelical praise and worship, but in a minor key with some Hebrew words. That's the basic.
Man, that sounds like a good time.
Yeah. That's the basic formula. And then so the idea in the Hebrew roots movement, as opposed to the Messianic movement, we can talk about that distinction a little bit later, but the idea was very egalitarian, very discussion oriented rather than sort of sermon oriented. So we'd sit down and we'd go through the Jewish lectionary, if you will, the Torah portion, and we'd read it, a chunk at a time. And we'd talk about it. Some of us had Bibles with commentaries, and we'd read some of those, and we'd have a conversation, a debate about what it meant. It was very much more like, even though it was our sort of church, as it were, it was much more like a what you would think of as a Bible study, where we're sitting around and we're having a conversation.
Did you read the New Testament at all?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Oh yeah.
I'm glad you asked that, Father, because that's one of my a clarifying question, right? Because you mentioned that you were doubting Easter, right?
Sure.
So like, what's the doctrine that I'm looking at here, right? Did you believe that Christ was Messiah, suffered, died, was buried, and rose again? Did you not believe in the resurrection? Was there a future Messiah that was coming?
So when it comes to Easter, the question was all about calendar. We believed Jesus was the Messiah and that he died and rose again, but we believed that we should be celebrating that on the Jewish liturgical calendar, the death on Passover itself, and then the resurrection on the Feast of First Fruits. One of the big debates that we had was about when the Feast of First Fruits is to be dated. Okay, because what Moses actually says is that you're to offer the first fruits on the day after the Sabbath, after Passover. The problem is that there's two Sabbaths. There's the festival Sabbath, right? Like a holy day of obligation or a solemnity. It's a Sabbath day. But then there's the weekly Sabbath that's going to happen during the week of unleavened bread. And so the question was always, which Sabbath is it after? Does that make, because Moses doesn't spell it out, and Jewish tradition is pretty clear on it, but we had this question, does that make the resurrection on the first day of the week, on a Sunday, or does it make it on whatever day comes after, on the 16th day of the month? Because the 15th day is the high Sabbath.
Okay, so these are questions that you're turning over in your mind as a 12 to 18-year-old?
Yes.
So in those like young teenage years, these are big questions that are on your plate with your family. Yeah. How many other families were involved with you in this?
There were quite a few out in West Texas. Okay. So there were, when I was growing up, there were probably 2 or 3 different groups that met in homes in Midland itself. And then there was one in Odessa, which is next door, and there was one in Big Spring, which is sort of the next town over the next way. And then there was...
Those are great Texas towns now.
Yeah. Oh, man, yeah. That's where my mom's from, is Big Spring. It's a little town, about 40,000. It's great. And then as I moved into high school, just before I left for college, we started going to the Messianic synagogue in town. So there was a proper sort of congregation.
Okay.
So there were.
And what's the difference between Messianic? So it's Messianic Jew, right? Like that's the.
Well, I'm hesitant to use that terminology because there's an odd history here. So the Messianic Jewish movement began in. No, let's go further back. So in the 19th century, there was this thing called the Hebrew Christian movement.
Was the word.
In the beginning. So in the 19th century, there's this thing called the Hebrew Christian movement. There was a push, especially in Protestant churches, to there have always been Jewish converts, but at this point there was a push to sort of go, well, look, their traditions are ancient and venerable, and they're in many ways compatible with Christianity. We need an option for these Jewish Christians to keep some of their traditions, to keep their culture that's compatible with Christianity. And so you had a few things like in the Church of England in the mid-19th century, there was a rabbi named Philip Levertov who converted, and he became an Anglican priest. And he actually developed a whole liturgy that was this sort of combination of the Jewish synagogue liturgy and the Book of Common Prayer. And it's really fascinating. So it was this attempt to create a sort of Jewish expression of Christianity, but it was mainstream Protestantism, but with Jewish customs. In the 60s and 70s, with the rise of the Jesus movement, this sort of became the Messianic Jewish movement. And it was still mainly focused on Jewish converts to Christianity who wanted to keep their many of their customs and practices, but this time with more of an evangelical or charismatic flavor, as that was the direction Protestantism was moving, rather than the old main line. At that time, because there was this idea of a return to original simplicity in the whole Jesus movement, you got a lot of Gentiles who wanted to participate in some way or another around the fringes. And that evolved into the modern Messianic movement in which Gentiles really outnumber Jewish converts or
Hmm.
Jewish families. And they're Torah observant. They keep the law of Moses in some way, shape, or form, and that looks different in different communities. But it's got its roots in this Hebrew Christianity and Messianic Judaism, but the practitioners are, the majority of them are no longer Jewish.
Hmm.
So I hesitate to call
Right.
it Jewish
Right.
because it's not exactly.
Yeah.
But
What was it
Yeah.
like in those years? And I'm thinking in particular of between the ages of 12 and 18, I'm remembering my appetite in those years, right? And just the way that I ate and the amount that I could eat. What was it like
The amount.
living in the capital, like the barbecue capital? And I know that's a controversial statement to say,
Sure.
but let's just call it like the barbecue capital, the Tex-Mex capital of the world, and keeping kosher.
well,
Like, what was
barbecue's-
that like?
Barbecue's great. Texas barbecue because it's beef. You can have Texas barbecue. You can have
Okay.
a kosher version of it. So that was great. Tex-Mex was a little bit more difficult. So okay, so one of the great controversies in Hebrew roots and Messianic circles is, can you have meat and dairy together? Because in Jewish tradition, you can't mix meat and dairy. That's unkosher. But this is based on a statement in the Bible, which just says, "Thou shalt not boil a kid in its mother's milk."
Mm.
Jewish tradition has interpreted that to mean no meat and dairy at the same time. But among the Hebrew roots movement, where we didn't necessarily accept Jewish tradition as authoritative, a lot of people ate meat and dairy together because they said, no, it means literally what it says. You can't boil a kid in its mother's milk. Modern academia inclines actually towards that view because we have found evidence of an Egyptian ritual, a sacrificial ritual that involved boiling an actual kid in its actual mother's milk. So that's probably what it's referring to, rather than a general prohibition on having meat and dairy at the same meal. But that's the tradition, and so this was a big controversy among us. So Tex-Mex was a big subject of debate because lots of cheese sauces and things like that. So
I can't imagine doing that. That must have been hard.
Yeah, so it was a sacrifice.
Well,
but there's a lot of good traditional Jewish food. So you didn't go hungry. It was just an adjustment to what your cuisine was.
Besides that, all right, and maybe this is the Northeast Connecticut idea coming out, Matt. I don't know if you share this thought with me, but as you're telling this story, Matthew, I'm thinking about you're in Texas, coming out of a Baptist background, and going into what seems like a small community of
Sure.
Religiously, but not. It's not like you're in a walled off society or anything. You're still like going to school. You still have friends. You still play with kids in the neighborhood. And we talked about shaking your worldview. Did you ever experience like a shaken worldview when? And again, my experience, if I've been in the South, is that people will talk about church pretty openly and pretty plainly. They'll talk to you about their Bible study. They'll ask you questions about what church you go to, and there's a freedom of religious discussion that can happen. What was it like for you with some ideas that I would imagine some of your Baptist friends or your mainline Protestant friends or evangelical Protestant friends living down there might have seemed a little bit odd, that you're wondering about when to keep the Feast of Booths, and they're like, I like Christmas.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Well, it was a really odd combination. For one thing, most of us homeschooled. Very few of us went to public or private school, and we were very invested in our religious life, and we weren't sort of isolationists, like sort of the Mennonite tradition or something like that. We weren't trying to separate ourselves, but we were so invested in our community that we spent most of our time with each other. And so yes, there was contact outside of that, but it was less than you'd expect from a community that was. We really weren't explicitly isolating ourselves, but we sort of effectively did it just by focusing in the community so much. But then evangelicalism has a kind of veneration for all things Jewish. And because I started learning Hebrew when I was like 13. I taught myself Aramaic in high school, and I could,
Like one does, you know,
as one does.
like who hasn't taught themselves Aramaic or something like
Yeah,
that.
of course. And so when discussions of the Bible and things like that came up, it really depended on what the group was. If it was like fundamental Baptists, uh, there's still an element of I don't want to say anti-Semitism, but certainly anti-Judaism there, and there was a strong resistance, but they tended to be very poorly educated. And even a basic education in Bible and ancient Near East, it wasn't really a challenging discussion.
Mm.
So they had opinions but very little information. The more mainstream evangelicals, the sort of Southern Baptists and into non-denomination, on the other hand, would just listen to me. They assumed I was probably right, even if they weren't going to start keeping kosher and things like that. They had this kind of veneration for things Jewish.
Yeah.
And so it was a very strange. There was not a lot of in Midland. There was not a lot of challenges that were issued to there were serious challenges that were issued to what we said. When I got more online, when I lived on the internet a little bit more in high school, then it became more challenging. I met mainline Protestants and I met Catholics and things who actually had some background in Bible and in tradition and the ancient Near East. But the academia largely was on my side, and this is still often the case that the academic view tends to be that the earliest Christians were considered themselves essentially a movement within Judaism. And so I had this sort of secular academy often on my side, and that made my job much easier. I could go, well, look, this is what E.P. Sanders says too.
Right. So there seems to be because you're talking about the Protestant veneration of, the Jewish history, right? It seems like that exists in Catholicism, right? I mean, maybe I'm off base, but I'm thinking of Brant Pitre, and like Jesus and the Jewish roots of the Eucharist, Jesus and the Jewish roots of Mary, Jesus and John Bergsma, right? Jesus and the Jewish roots of the priesthood, right? And so like things like that, this desire to go back to the Old Testament, study it, apply it. And so like in the danger of, not that I think that it's coming off this way, but in the danger of it seeming as if we're saying that this whole movement is no good, right? Like what's the proper balance? How should a Catholic approach not the incorporation of Jewish practice, but you know what I mean? Like recognizing types and antitypes.
Well, I actually think this ties right back to sort of where I left off when I was in college.
Fantastic.
And I was starting to, this is perfect. Because I developed this deep distrust of Messianic sources, because I was learning as I engaged in real academic church history and really engaged with primary sources and with solid research.
What are some of those sources?
Sure. So we looked at the Apostolic Fathers quite frequently to see what their practice looked like. So guys like Ignatius and Irenaeus, and what they were saying did not align with what I assumed Christians in the 2nd century did. I came to distrust Messianic sources, and so my approach in college was I wouldn't read anything by a Messianic because I didn't think they knew what they were talking about anymore. I would alternate. I had a system by which I would alternate. I'll read some modern academic sources, preferably from believing Christians, but secular sources as well. And then I would read Jewish sources, but I would not read anything in between. I wasn't going to read. I completely lost trust in 99% of the Messianic writers. There were a few key ones that still seemed to know what they were talking about, but most of them, it was very clear they were speaking from almost total ignorance. Um, but what blew me away was the depth of understanding of the Jewish roots of Christianity that existed in these Catholic sources. So the ones that really surprised me, that I read most of, were N.T. Wright, who was an Anglican bishop of all things, and then worse still was Joseph Ratzinger, Benedict XVI, and it was absolutely appalling that the Pope knew more about ancient Judaism than I did, because one of our mantras was, if the Christians only knew what we know, they would act like we do. And then I read Jesus of Nazareth. I read all three of them, and I went, this guy knows more than I do. And that's completely unacceptable.
I often say that about the Pope. This is unacceptable.
I like that you wanted to challenge Joseph Ratzinger to a theology off. I think that's really good. Yeah. Nice.
Yeah. And he did. He won handily. And so what became clear was that our understanding of what ancient Judaism was one of the things that was twisted. That we tended to read Jewish sources from late antiquity and the medieval period as if they were perfect representations of Second Temple Judaism. And they're not trying to be. That was our mistake, not theirs. They were simply developing their tradition to new circumstances. The temple is destroyed in 70 AD, and then all Jews are exiled from Judea after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and they're having to adapt to this new situation. And so out of that emerges the Mishnah and the Talmud, where they go, all right, we don't have a temple. What are we going to do? How are we going to live our ritual life in these circumstances? And they come up with answers that make sense for their situation. And then we would go back and read the Talmud and go, okay, all of this is what it was actually like in the 1st century AD, 1st century BC. And that simply wasn't true. And what happened with historical Christianity is that it grew separately out of that Second Temple Judaism. It grew out of how Israel lived when there was a temple, when there was a sacrificial cult, rather than out of this other branch, which is related and shares a lot of material and a lot of traditions, but it's not one-to-one. It's not supposed to be. It doesn't pretend to be. There's a whole history there wherein I say it doesn't pretend to be. Starting in the 18th century in Northern and Western Europe, there was a movement that treated the Talmud and Mishnah as if they were that kind of perfect representation, but for most of Jewish history, that's not been the understanding of what Jewish sources are. So, but Christianity grew not out of what we think of as Judaism, but out of the same source as Judaism. They have a common root, but Christianity isn't an offshoot of post-Second Temple Judaism, and so its traditions evolved differently. Its understanding evolved differently because of its understanding of what the Messiah was, of what Jesus is. And my impression as I came away from reading Ratzinger was, in the Messianic movement, we said, well, Jesus came and basically renewed our understanding of the law of Moses, but didn't change anything. And what Ratzinger made clear to me was, no, he changed everything, but he kept everything. What we had revolted against was this Protestant idea that he got rid of some things and kept other things, which is incoherent. And what the Catholic tradition is, no, he kept everything, but nothing is unchanged. So, whereas the Protestant tradition goes, he got rid of all of the rituals and he kept the moral teachings more or less as they are. And the Catholic tradition looks at the Gospels and it says, well, no, he clearly transformed the moral teaching. He doesn't say, he doesn't just say, thou shalt not kill. He says, don't hate in your heart, because that's where murder comes from. He's always going back to the original state in Eden, as he does with the ruling ends of force, where he says, yeah, that's not how it was from the beginning. Moses gave you an exemption because you were too weak. But we're going to return to the original principle, which is not sort of a legal contract for marriage. It's an ontic unification of people. So it's all of this return to the primordial state, return to a more fundamental reality. And the same thing is true of the rituals. He doesn't say get rid of the temple. He says someone greater than the temple is here. He doesn't say we're going to get rid of the sacrificial cult. He says the sacrificial cult is going to be transformed. You're going to have the sacrifice, but it's one sacrifice which fulfills all of them, and you're going to continue to have that with you. So it's all transformed, but it's all kept. Nothing is left out.
As you're describing this, I'm wondering, okay, everything that you say that all makes perfect sense, that Jesus transforms everything and doesn't get rid of anything. Well, I'm wondering, because I don't know anything about either the Messianic movement or the Hebrew roots movement, really, other than this conversation. So this is a lot of fun. Sure. You're exposing me to new ideas. It's not shaking my worldview, but
sure.
Father Sam will continue
really
to eat Tex-Mex.
Yeah, I will happily mix my meat and dairy. But I guess what I'm wondering is, as you look back now, would you say that the focus in the Hebrew roots movement or in the Messianic movement got so focused on trying to figure out the Old Testament and the particular practices of first century Judaism that in a certain way, though you were believers in Jesus, that the Messiah has come, do you now look back and say, it's almost like we forgot to pay attention to Jesus because we were so focused on trying to understand the old Jewish practice that we never really paid attention to what Jesus said about the old Jewish practice?
You can never generalize about the Messianic movement.
Okay.
But that did happen. That did happen. There are absolutely places where Jesus was still the focus. There are absolutely congregations and individuals where Jesus was still the focus. But that was a real risk, and it did happen. And this was one of my real struggles when I was in college, and I was trying to reconcile Jewish tradition in particular with our belief in Jesus. And I was going, we need this normative tradition, or else we can't have community, because we can't agree on anything, but Jesus doesn't always agree with it. And so in what sense is he my rabbi if I allow the consensus view to overrule him? But if I don't allow the consensus view to overrule him, then how are we ever going to have unity? How are we ever going to have any living interpretive voice that can put an end to debates?
So considering the authoritative voice, right? So the first question I have is just a simple clarifying question, which is it fair to say that the difference between the two movements, right, meaning the Christian understanding of Judaism and the Messianic understanding or the Hebrew roots understanding, is that it's basically just two different traditions? Like, is that fair to say that it's two different? You said it's the same root, but it feels like there's a clear departure, right, in that medieval era. So there's two different traditions, and the Messianic view misunderstood the one tradition to be earlier, more ancient than it is.
Essentially,
okay.
That's right. The Messianic view was that Judaism, as it evolved in late antiquity and into the medieval period,
right, was actually the ancient
was the Judaism of Jesus,
okay.
And that's not really true.
Right, and so thank you for that. And then the second thing is we're talking about the authoritative voice, balancing authority and like a libertarian approach to Christianity. And so did you were clearly seeking the authoritative voice, it seems, earlier on. Like I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, you lived it, but it seems like you were like a 12-year-old looking for some authority on these things. But when you got to school, when you got to Baylor, right, did that lead you into Anglicanism? Am I correct? That's where you went next?
Yes, it did, because the difference, I think, the really concrete difference between this Hebrew roots movement, Messianic movement, and evangelicalism was that because we were trying to get ritual things right, and we were trying to get these very concrete things, we were trying to get on the same page about them, it really raised to the forefront the fact that there needed to be an authoritative interpreter, because we just couldn't agree. And the thing is, we couldn't agree when we were Baptists, but we could eat together because we didn't think there were rules about that.
Right.
So it didn't matter as much. It's like we could disagree about predestination or something like that, a major discussion among Baptists. But we could have dinner together. We celebrated the same holidays. It was we went to church the same day, and it didn't matter as much. And then you get to trying to observe feasts and Sabbaths without clear calendrical guidance, and you try to observe kashrut without clear dietary guidance, and suddenly it's like we can't even eat, we can't have a meal together, we can't even talk about our disagreements over dinner, and it became very concrete.
Yeah, because I'm bringing bacon wrapped scallops every time, just
yeah. So it really concretized the problem in a way that was less avoidable than it was in the evangelical circles that we had started.
Right. I mean, I think that there's, and this is I guess a brief little tangent, but you brought up some I guess form criticism, or I don't know, some kind of critical theory with the kid and the goat, and the milk rather.
Yeah.
I think that so I mean, this is like my personal approach, and I would love to be further educated on it. Which is, there is room for interpretations, or at least maybe what I mean by that is people do interpret Scripture differently, and so tradition is the key. Like when it comes to these textual criticisms, when it comes to these determining like rituals and determining calendars, like tradition is the thing passed on through the magisterium, right? So like that was huge for me when those things click together of like, well, why do we believe it's virgin and not young maiden in Isaiah? It's like, well, because the tradition says so, and so so that was huge for me. Like, how did you come to that?
Well, it was through this recognition that we needed tradition, and I accepted Jewish tradition first, but there remained that tension. So I agree with your approach. As a young man, I knew that tradition was necessary, but I was sure it couldn't be Christian tradition, because Christian tradition was, as far as I was concerned, overtly pagan. You had idols.
You must have loved hearing about Our Lady of Guadalupe.
I didn't. I mean, I didn't hear any of the details about like Juan Diego being reflected in her eyes and things like that until years after I'd become Catholic. Yeah.
Good.
But look, Our Lady of Guadalupe, the imagery it's Aztec imagery, and that's on purpose. But to me as a Messianic, I went, that's obviously pagan. That's obviously, this is not the Virgin Mary. This is not the mother of the Messiah. This is some Aztec goddess who's masquerading, who's tricking all of these Catholics into being pagans.
The other way around, she tricked all the pagans into being Catholics.
Exactly, which is what actually happened. Right? It's Our Lady going, all right, is this the imagery you understand? I'm going to show you who I am in that image, in that imagery, using that symbolism. Right. That's absolutely right. So, but that is the transition that I had to make. I had to go, the teaching of Jesus is not perfectly aligned with the Jewish oral tradition. he follows him in some places and he doesn't in other places. And if one of these is right, it has to be Jesus. But I still need an oral tradition. So I knew I could never go back to evangelicalism. I could never be a Baptist or anything like that because I couldn't make sense of the Bible. There was no way to interpret it. There was no way to understand it without some tradition coming in and telling me how to understand it. And so, yeah, in college, I mean, I still had a lot of anti-Catholicism. I still, I still, that was deeply ingrained. And I had a lot of Anglican friends. That was sort of the cool thing at Baylor, was to become Anglican. And so I ended up joining the Anglican Church in North America, the conservative breakaway from the Episcopal Church.
Can we pause on that? The cool
Sure.
thing to do at Baylor,
Yeah,
because I don't know. I think there's something really fascinating about this. Like you look at some of the Catholic universities, and the cool thing to do for some of them was to either start going exclusively to the traditional Latin Mass or to start going to a Byzantine Mass or something, right? Like that was the cool thing to do at some of those Catholic schools. You're at a Baptist school, right? Baylor's a Baptist school.
Yeah.
So you go to Baylor, which besides having an up-and-coming athletic program that's just getting better by the year, is also a very Baptist school. And you're saying that the cool thing for the religious students to do was to go and become Anglican.
Well, so every university I've been to, both the theology and the classics faculty have had a joke that they think is exclusive to them. They go, only at our university would you come in, none of them were Catholic. Does everyone come in, whatever they are, and then they all leave Catholic? That was the case at Baylor, it was the case at Duke, and it was the case at St. Andrews, and they all joked about it. Haha, only here. No, this is what happens as you get educated. What seems to happen is everybody comes in at whatever sort of rung on the ecclesiastical ladder they're on and leaves at least one rung higher, maybe two. So I don't know where non-denominationals get their clergy, because all the non-denoms would come in and they'd leave Baptist, and the Baptists would leave Presbyterian. The Presbyterians would leave Anglican, and the Anglicans all left Catholic. Like there was no. So
it's amazing.
It was consistent across all three of those universities. So, yeah. So when I say it was the cool thing to become Anglican, it sort of depended on what your starting place was.
Right.
Because I knew a lot of people who became Catholic at Baylor as well. But for me at that point, that was still a little bit of a bridge too far. I was deeply attached to the prayer book. I love in Judaism, there's a prayer book called the Siddur, which has everything that you need in it. I carried my Siddur with me everywhere. I was always praying out of my Siddur, and I may have become Anglican just because of the Book of Common Prayer.
Right.
There was a book, it replaced that need to have, here's the prayer book. This is all you, this and a Bible, and you're good. And I really loved that. I loved having that with me. When I first left the Messianic movement, so the big precipitous moment was actually about this. Who are we? What's our identity? Are we Israelites? Are we Jews? Are we Gentiles who observe the Torah? And I didn't have an answer to it because nothing seemed to mesh with our practice and with what St. Paul said. And the only Messianics that I still respected were these guys called First Fruits of Zion. And they came to our synagogue while I was at home from university. And I was in a deep dive on modern scholarship of early Christian understanding of their identity. I'm trying to get my head around it. And they gave this presentation, which they called the Divine Invitation. And the idea was that Jewish believers in Jesus were still required to keep the law of Moses, and Gentile believers were invited to, but not required to. And that immediately, to me, set off alarm bells, because I went, you're re-erecting the dividing wall. You're creating first and second class citizens.
This was settled at the Council of Jerusalem.
Yeah, exactly.
I believe Acts 15 addresses this directly.
Conclusion in Acts. Yeah. And so that I went, that this doesn't mesh, and you're the only guys I listen to anymore in our movement. if you don't have an answer, then we don't have an answer. And so when I went back to school, I took off my kippah, and I took off my tzitziot, my fringes, and I told my mom, I don't know what church I'm joining, but it's going to be one of the ones with apostolic succession. And it I felt naked because every part of my day and every part of my life was ritual. Every part of my life was about worship. There's a prayer for everything. You get up in the morning, the way you get dressed is religious. The way you bathe is religious. The way you eat is religious. Everything had a ritual. And then I'm just stepping out into the world completely unclothed. And that was very, very uncomfortable. It was very isolating in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things that really drew me to Anglicanism was when I had a Book of Common Prayer in my hands, I felt, I was like, oh, I'm clothed again.
Right.
Here are my rituals. And they were much simpler, much more limited than my Jewish ones. But it gave me some kind of armor to put on again.
Right.
And I really needed that.
So
in that feeling of being like naked, I mean, there's literally taking off some of those garments that had the ritual significance and everything. But then what was the response like from family and from friends that you had within that Messianic community, from within your synagogue? Like, what was the response that you got?
Sure. My parents really were sympathetic at that point. They were getting frustrated with what seemed to be a lack of answers on some of these important topics. And so they stayed in the movement for a couple of more years, but they ended up leaving as well. And so at the time, they didn't agree with me, but they were very sympathetic. They went, we understand we don't have clear answers to these questions. And it doesn't seem like historic Christianity is really pagan, even if we think it's misguided. Within a couple of years, they followed me into the Anglican Church.
Oh, okay.
As far as the larger community, they really didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to discuss it. By that time I was off at Baylor, and then after Baylor I went on to Duke, and so I wasn't at home very much. I wasn't in Midland very often, and when I was, and when I would see those old friends, they really wanted to talk about anything else.
Right.
It just was, they were not interested in addressing it, and we didn't have any idea of excommunication or ostracization or anything like that. But it was just, they were very uncomfortable and they didn't want to talk about it. So
how were you able to, right, so you're talking about how ritualistic every activity of the day is. Were you ever able to bring that, because I guess it would be more, quote, spiritual, as a Catholic, than it would be physical. But were you able to bring that idea into your Catholic faith? Trying to ritualize.
Oh, dude, it's so physical. No, so we've lost so many of our traditions in modern Catholicism, but it's all there. Yeah. Even the like really material aspects of it. So you get up in the morning and you put on a scapular.
Yeah, fair enough. Which I do, just for the record.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And there's we used to have all kinds of traditions, like washing your hands with holy water before you handle a Bible or anything else or any kind of sacramental. And I've got my container of holy water right up there because I still wash my hands before I touch a Bible.
Okay.
Like there's all kinds of and yes, our dietary rules are different, but
right.
But we still have dietary laws. You can't eat meat on Fridays.
Yeah.
I really think one of our great losses in the 20th century was giving into this Protestant idea that it's all spiritual. G.K. Chesterton talks about he would make the sign of the cross with every match before he lit his pipe. When I was at Duke, I was explaining this to a friend who was a Methodist seminarian, and he said something dismissive about it being magic, and I went, no. If you can kneel and that be a part of your prayer, then physical gestures matter. C.S. Lewis has a lot about this in Letters to Malcolm. Your physical posture matters. You're not a body that contains a soul. You're not. Your body and soul together, and your body absolutely should be involved in worship.
Right.
I remember years back, my first exposure to this beautiful monastic order, the monastic community of Bethlehem of the Assumption of the Virgin and of St. Bruno. They're awesome. They only have one foundation in the United States, and it's in Livingston Manor, New York. And I met them actually in Spain, and then a friend of mine who was discerning her vocation with them told me, she said, "Do you know where New York is?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And she said, they're in the Archdiocese of New York. And I said, "Well, that's very close to me. I can go and visit them." Anyway, they live this hermitic life, so they're basically hermits all the time. But when they come together for their prayer, the prayer is extraordinarily physical. They make these profound bows, the metanies. They make the sign of the cross, and like their sign of the cross starts at the back of their head, and then it comes all the way down to the belly button and goes like across. It's huge. And then they bow and they touch the ground, and they go around. They've got icons, and they kiss the icons. They prostrate themselves during the consecration, face down on the ground. And then when they have their time of thanksgiving after Mass, there's kneeling, and then there's a time of prostration. Everything is with this very physical notion. And I remember the first time I was with them, it must have been during the octave of Christmas. And so I was with them. I remember it was very cold, and it was not yet. So it must have been the octave of Christmas. So I was with them for a few days there, and just witnessing the way that they were praying. And I started to realize that this is the incarnation. And this is why the incarnation matters so much, that God became man, not to spiritualize us exclusively, yes, to raise us up spiritually to a different plane, but also to sort of reinvigorate this body. And so the incarnation and making our prayer something that is incarnational is profound and beautiful.
Yeah, the spiritualization doesn't mean disembodiment.
Right.
It means the elevation of the body. That's why in fact, the literal elevation of the body, because Christ still has his body. It's in heaven, in the Godhead itself, but it's still a body. Yeah. But and this was, yes, as an Anglican, there was a lot of pressure to spiritualize and to de-emphasize the physical aspects of ritual and prayer. But that was one thing that really appealed to me about the Anglo-Catholic expression of Anglicanism. And one of the things that ended up drawing me to Catholicism was this intense spiritualization of the physical that I'd known from Jewish practice. We're part of the Anglican Ordinariate, and we do morning and evening prayer as a family from the divine worship, from the daily office, and it's intensely physical. You genuflect, you bow, repeatedly make the sign of the cross, and it has the same kind of rich physicality that the Jewish tradition does. And if you really lean into that, you'll see that all of these traditions, again, it's very much like I was saying before, the ritual traditions are not gone. They're transformed, but the same kind of sanctification of the body is in Catholic devotion as it is in Jewish tradition.
Talk a little bit about that importance of ritual in the context of your spiritual life, and what it means to have that deep sense of a ritual prayer, not just the physical externals, because those are important, but just the idea of there's a ritual to follow, and what that does for you on a spiritual in your spiritual life, rather.
So one of the things that I'm very convinced of is that when St. Paul says pray without ceasing, one of the things he's thinking about is the daily hours of prayer, that they transform the day into prayer. There's an office that you stop every couple of hours and you pray, and it redirects everything that you're doing to be prayer. It incorporates all of the work into ritual. It incorporates all of your daily life into prayer. One of the things that was deeply formative to me when I had decided to become Catholic, but I hadn't finished RCIA yet, was reading the Rule of St. Benedict. And this concept of ora et labora, work and prayer, by which he really means ora et ora, making the work a form of prayer, transforming everything into prayer. That life becomes prayer, and that happens through ritual. That ritual recenters, it redirects everything to the sacred. What's really significant, I think, comes from John Henry Newman, though Chesterton restates it. From one of his homilies called he makes his ministers a flame of fire. There's a quote from Psalms. Newman argues that all movement, it may have physical causes, but that's not a sufficient explanation of movement, and that all movement has an intellect behind it. That behind everything in the physical world that moves, there is a living will. There's a spirit. That when you look at a tree and you see it waving in the wind, you shouldn't think of it as, merely molecules in the air moving from a high pressure area to a low pressure area, which shakes the tree. There is a living will behind it. There's an angelic spirit, and that should transform your relationship to the natural world, and really give you this mystical sense of the world, that it's not just what it looks like on the surface. I spend a lot of time talking about Isaiah chapter 6. Let me start over. This is the significance of ritual to me. It all comes back to Isaiah chapter 6. There's this debate.
Okay, Matt, cut out everything else that he just said.
Yeah, forget it.
We'll pick up here. Yeah.
This is the significance of ritual. There's this debate in academia. Where is Isaiah's vision taking place in Isaiah chapter 6? This is the one Uzziah has died, and then Isaiah has this vision of the divine king, of God sitting on the throne. He's being ministered to by angels, and the train of his robe fills the temple, and then the angels start to sing, "Holy, holy, holy," and the pillars of the house shake. And then Isaiah throws himself on the ground and he says, "Woe is me, I am unmade, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell among a people of unclean lips. But mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts." And then the seraph, the angel, takes tongs, and he takes a coal from the altar, and he touches it to Isaiah's lips, and he says, "Now this has touched your lips, you're made clean." And so there's this debate. Where is this happening? Is this in the temple? Because God's presence is understood to be in the Holy of Holies, but the description doesn't exactly match the temple itself. So is he like transported into heaven? What's happening? And there's this whole argument about it. But it's very clear that tension is the point. When you think about what his mission is and what he's told to prophesy to the Israelites right afterwards. Because what he's told to prophesy is seeing you do not see, and hearing you do not understand. Isaiah is standing in the court of the temple, and he's seeing these physical things, and then a change happens. He sees first these two bronze statues of cherubs in the holy place, and there's this golden altar for incense, and behind that is the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is with the mercy seat on top, which is supposed to be the divine throne in the temple. And Isaiah is just saying that stuff. And then all of a sudden, his eyes are open and he sees the realities behind it. Mm-hmm. And instead of seeing statues of seraphs, which a seraph in Hebrew literally is, it's a flame. It's a fire. And so you can imagine these bronze statues, and then he suddenly sees them not as bronze, but as living flame. And then he suddenly sees the altar of incense not as just a golden altar in the temple, but as the altar of the prayers of the saints in heaven, like you see in Revelation. And he doesn't just see the golden throne in the Holy of Holies. He actually sees the divine presence there, and he panics because he suddenly realizes, I'm a liar. I'm a man of unclean lips. And I say I believe this stuff, and then I don't act like it. I'm a hypocrite. And then his mission to Israel is to tell them what he's just seen. All you see is the physical furniture in the temple. You don't see what it really is, and you don't act like you're in the presence of God himself. And that's the whole world. The whole world has that divine ritual significance. It's all an icon. And that's what I think daily ritual does for us, is it reopens that reality. It reopens our eyes to the underlying spiritual reality where all of this is not just what it appears on the surface. All of it is an icon of Christ.
Can you extend this for us from daily ritual into sacramental theology?
Oh man, the only way I'm working on a book right now of poetry, which is directed at trying to show the underlying reality of the concept is to take a day and go through the hours as well as the mass to talk about what's happening underneath. But I mean, there's really not much better than, if I can get it off the shelf, than Scott Hahn's The Lamb's Supper, to talk about this underlying reality in the liturgy.
Well, we love Scott Hahn here at the Tangent, so
yeah.
The great moment for me. There is one thing that I think he left out. I don't believe it's in here. So I'll focus on that just so that I'm not.
Yeah, no, let's correct Scott Hahn. I think that's a good move.
No, just something. No. To be clear, it's just he's got a specific topic, which is Revelation.
Matthew, I will email the St. Paul Center. Okay.
Okay. Right. Yeah, Scott, you messed up. No. No. This is just a topic he didn't get to.
That's so
but
good.
There's a tradition in Eastern Christianity that Moses and Elijah both have the same. They have their visions of God have an interesting overlap. They go into a cave on Mount Sinai, and then they come out and they see some vision of God. In Exodus, it says that God allows him to see his back, not his front, but his back. And then in First Kings, it says that Samuel is allowed to hear the voice, right? There's a storm and an earthquake and a fire, and God's not in any of those. And then Elijah hears a still small voice. So there's this odd overlap in these theophanies and these appearances of God, that they go into a cave and then they come out and they get something smaller or less than they expect. They expect the great theophany, the overwhelming image like Isaiah has, something smaller and quieter and simpler. And there's an Eastern tradition that those two aren't like transported to heaven. They're actually transported through time. And what they saw is the transfiguration, is the Mount of Transfiguration. And so the reason it's smaller and quieter than they expected is because what they see is the incarnation. So they see God incarnate. They see his back, as it were, his incarnate form. They hear a still small voice because it's a human voice rather than a sort of thunderous voice from heaven.
Ooh, I like that image.
And
like mystically transported through time to witness the incarnation and to be there at Mount Tabor for the transfiguration, conversing with the incarnate God. Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
And there's a reason, and this plays into the Mass. This goes back to the Mass. It's because God is eternal, and that doesn't stop being the case when he becomes incarnate.
Right.
So Christ has this dual reality where he's living in time, but he's also living in the eternal now of God. And around the incarnation, time gets really, for my Whovians out there, wibbly wobbly, timey wimey. It doesn't quite make sense. That's why before Abraham was, I am. And so this is what happens in the Mass too. I tell my students that the Mass is a time machine. The reason we're able to celebrate the Eucharist, the reason we're able to say this is Christ's body really and truly as it's sacrificed on the cross, is because we're through that eternal now of God in which Christ lives, in which he exists, we're actually participating in the crucifixion. We're actually there because we're actually entering the eternal liturgy in heaven. And so that the passion really happens not just in time, but that time is taken up into the eternal worship in heaven. So when you're in the Mass, you're not just now. You're not really in time anymore. You don't go in there for an hour or 90 minutes. You're there in eternity, and then an hour or 90 minutes happens to also pass outside. That's the best I can do at explaining this
I gotta tell you, that was pretty good. So.
Reality. Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very important element. Like there's priests. I remember, I wasn't even aware that I did it, but I was convicted when a priest talked about not wearing his watch during Mass, and so I've made every effort since then to make sure that my watch is not on me during Mass. Precisely for that point, that Mass is meant to be a step outside of time. And so time passes out there, but in here, it doesn't. We're meant to be just here, be present, be in the now, in that eternal now of God. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's awesome.
I love
Fantastic. Thank you, Matthew.
Awesome. Yeah, of course.
Where can folks find your book, The Two Jerusalems?
So the best way is through Ignatius.com. You can order it directly from Ignatius. It's also available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble on their websites. And I can't vouch for your local Catholic bookstore, but I have seen a number of them carrying it. So if they carry Ignatius books, they can order it for you as well.
Awesome.
Great. Congratulations on the release.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks for being with us today. This is great.
Thank you for having me.
No.
We just had a great opportunity to talk to Matthew Wiseman.
Yeah, they know that. They've already listened to it.
Oh, right. We're doing the outro.
This is the outro.
Okay, I am cutting this out. That way I don't sound like
Oh,
an
no,
idiot.
I think it absolutely has to stay. I demand that this stay in. No editing
sell it
process.
to you for a price.
Just leave it uncut. I think it's beautiful. No, I'm disappointed. I didn't say this when we recorded. I said it to Matthew right before we started, before you got on, that I've not read the book yet.
I gotta when you said he went to school and I had read that he was homeschooled, I was like, he didn't read the book yet.
No, definitely did not
There
read
it
the
is,
book.
giving it away.
No, and I apologize to him because I just haven't had a chance yet ahead of time. But
Yeah.
just glancing through and seeing this.
We did
this
only
journey.
receive it a few days ago, just to give you a.
Yeah, and
out.
we received it as an electronic copy, not like a real book either. So like, well, it's
you're
all
good,
fine.
good.
It's all fine. We love Ignatius Press.
Did you just see me hit my face with my own microphone?
Nice. I think that's great.
Yeah, this outro is going fantastic.
So good. No, but even just the little description that they gave us ahead of time, that here's this man who grew up, started as a Baptist, started in the Hebrew roots movement, the Messianic Judaism movement, and then to the Anglicans, then to Catholicism. I'm moved by the idea of him seeking and constantly seeking to understand more and to come to a deeper understanding. Because I think that too often we actually get kind of complacent and satisfied. Like, I don't need to understand anything more. I know what this is. I know the story and I'm fine. I don't need anything else. But there's this beauty of like his unrest, which it's not a bad unrest. It's just a desire to know more. And yeah, I was really moved by that. And then he's a fun guy to talk to.
Yeah, he certainly is.
Wow.
He certainly is. I was really grateful for the insight he gave us on the different traditions between the Hebrew roots movement and an authentic an authentic inclusion of Jewish tradition that's then transformed.
Yeah.
Right. That was something that I had no idea that was the difference maker. And I think it will, like, that's a hermeneutic, like that's a key to reading so much, like that's a key to understanding so much. So I'm really grateful for that. I feel like you don't often receive pieces of information that can affect everything, and I feel like I got that. Like, I'll read Catholic versus other sources differently because of that key. So yeah, a really, really great insight.
Yeah. Yeah. And it brings me back to, like, he was talking about Ratzinger. Makes me want to reread Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
The whole thing.
I've only read the first one, so I intend to read the rest of them. Of course, Word on Fire is putting out all of his writings in English.
I heard about
over
that.
the next 10 years.
Yeah, how exciting!
Yeah, they got the publishing rights from the Vatican. And the first they're going to put out two books collections per year, and the first collection is a nicely arranged and ribboned version of all 3 Jesus of Nazareth books.
I'm going to be honest, I'm not a fan of the ribbons.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I'm a sucker for a ribbon.
I like ribbons in my liturgical books. They're super helpful. And employed appropriately, there's a logic to the ribbons, and they help. But like ribbon as bookmark, because you know what always happens? The ribbon is never properly placed in the binding. It's always over too far to the right or too far to the left. And so like it's never even. It's always like the ribbon is like stretched unnaturally for certain spots if you've got to stop early in the book or late in the book. So no, I'm opposed to the ribbon in the in the book
Not
that
your
you're reading.
preferred kind of bookmark.
No,
you are a particular person.
I really am, but like I don't like a ribbon. Like I loved the Dale Ahlquist Word on Fire published annotated G.K. Chesterton's Everlasting Man.
Right, yes.
Fascinating. It's so good. His commentary is brilliant. Everything about it. It's a hardcover. It's a nice book to hold. But this ribbon, I'm like, I'm just not about the ribbon.
Did you
the
cut
ribbon,
it out?
it's in the wrong. Look,
Did
on
you cut
the
it
binding,
out?
right? You've got that little binding here, and like the ribbon should be right smack dab in the middle so that it can easily and effectively go everywhere. But no, the ribbon is like off to one side, and it exaggerates, creates too much tension, and I'm not here for it.
This is what the people are here for, Father Sam.
Look, I have opinions, and you're going to hear about them.
Well, regardless of your taste in bookmark, I'm excited about the Word on Fire Joseph Ratzinger collection. Okay.
I like a nice holy card.
Yes,
like,
sure.
I can use that.
Invites you to prayer before you learn.
I like forgetting that I put a holy card in a particular book, and then pulling that book off the shelf and being like, "Oh, I wondered what happened to that card."
Oh, I was wondering where Saint Charbel went.
Speaking of holy cards and the monastic community of Bethlehem of the Assumption of the Virgin and of Saint Bruno,
I love the name of that. I love that.
It's a fantastic name.
Oh my gosh,
it's a fantastic name for a religious community.
Yes.
I called them once because I wanted to. I just wanted to come up for a day, and so I called and said, "Would it be okay if I did this?" Yeah, that's fine, Father. Okay, so I got up to their chapel, and sitting at the door of the chapel is a little note, Father Sam, and folded into this note are some holy cards that had fallen out of my Bible when I had last been there to visit, and they found them in my hermitage, and they left them for me so that I wouldn't lose them. And I was like,
nice.
Holy cards.
That is a nice touch.
Make their return to me somehow. And the fact that these sisters put them aside, I'm like, nobody needs these. It's okay.
Yeah.
They're nice holy cards, but like anybody can find these anywhere. Like I promise you, there's some Catholic charity that will send you a bunch of these for nothing.
Yeah.
Hoping that you'll give them a donation.
Shout out Spirit Juice Studios. They sent us a bunch of merch from the Father Flanagan movie.
Oh, sweet.
Oh, yeah.
When do I get my cut?
Yeah. But they sent me a Father Flanagan holy card.
Oh, sweet.
And by me, I mean us, and I'm keeping it.
Can we get more of those? Because I really want them.
I actually, so they sent us that, and they sent us a T-shirt and a poster, a couple candles, a sticker, and like a really nice handwritten note from the producers of the movie.
That's awesome.
So I have to email them. I'll include you in the email.
I'm sorry, I got distracted when you said candles, so now I'm trying to can we call them Flana candles? No, that's not right.
No. We just pitched them a bunch of marketing ideas. Flana candles, top of the list.
I would love Spirit Juice Studios. I would love it if you would send me 500 holy cards so that I can distribute them to people. I will spread devotion.
Request
and ask
made.
People to pray for the intercession of Father Flanagan.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be so cool.
Yeah. When I rework my studio, I intend to put the Father Flanagan poster up in the background.
Nice.
Yeah. Anyway, so I don't know how I got there, but Father Flanagan, pray for us.
Amen. And
usually we say that at the beginning, but
it's here now.
Outro.
And I guess since this is our first episode of the new year, we should wish people a happy new year.
Yes, happy new year.
Yeah, happy new year.
Yeah.
All right.
Happy new year, Father.
Thanks, you too, Matt.
All right, catch you later.
See ya.